The ICF Training and Technical Assistance Team is honored to welcome you to this California Housing and Community Development Training session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. I am Chris Pitcher from ICF, and I will be hosting today's session. Today's training session is part of our community workshop series and is all about rent reasonableness and fair market rent, or FMR. It is my distinct pleasure and privilege to hand over the session to our first presenter today, Karen Cowell. Karen?
Thanks, Chris. Good afternoon. It's just afternoon in California. My name is Karen Cowell, and I'm a directing analyst at Homebase, and I'm one of the presenters today. I use she, they pronouns, and we're excited to have this topic with you. I'll have Chris introduce himself as my co-presenter.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Chris Andrews, he, his pronouns with MDG Associates, and excited to be here with you all.
Great. Okay, so we just wanted to, as usual, many of you are used to these community workshops. We thought we would just do a little icebreaker and introduction, see who's here, name, pronouns, what community you work in, what role you have, and then we have a little icebreaker question kind of related to our topic. What is the favorite thing about the neighborhood or area where you live? So we have folks a couple minutes to do that. Chat is awfully quiet though, isn't it? Oh, there's Chris. Thanks, Chris. Kristen. Okay, let's wait another minute. It feels like people are joining and getting settled and entering their responses. Rural community, awesome. Okay, hope people can keep filling that in as we go, and we'll move on to the next slide. So just wanted to talk for a minute about what we hope to cover and what our learning objectives are. So those of you who came here looking for a basic understanding or a little bit of understanding about rent reasonableness and FMR, will certainly give that to you, an understanding of how it relates to different program components, under how it works under ESG and ESG-CV. We really want to move folks to a different level too with rent reasonableness and FMR, and talk about expand our thinking beyond just what we usually think about with rent reasonableness and FMR, which is basically the cost of rent and utilities, but thinking about what or where is a healthy place to live and why is that, which was the impetus for that question. And the icebreaker, thinking about what we like about where we live, can help us kind of prep us for thinking about how we're helping others find a healthy place to live. And then we thought it would be important, because we know this occurs, that we go through some examples, and because the guidance maybe for some on paper seems straightforward, but we know that there's challenges that folks confront in determining and determining rent reasonableness. So I wanted to talk for just a minute about the program components. This training series really focuses on ESG and ESG-CV. So we wanted to highlight, so we'll highlight those funding sources for the most part, but we will talk about some other ones. We wanted to note that for ESG-CV, the program components that need to utilize FMR and rent reasonableness are rapid rehousing and homelessness prevention. The reason for that is because these are the components that are providing short-term or medium-term rental assistance. So rent reasonableness and FMR is tied to the provision of rent for individual units. So we also wanted to just take 1 second to, bring it back to what's important. We do these trainings and we concern ourselves with the regulations and all of the rules about things, but, we can't forget the goal. The reason we have the ESG-CV funds is to mitigate the effects of coronavirus. And we know it can fund many things like shelter and street outreach. We also, again, don't want to lose sight of the fact that the best way to mitigate coronavirus and end someone's homeless experience is to provide them with housing. And of course, when we're talking about housing, we're talking about grounding that in housing first. Some of you may have been on another training that we did, workshop about habitability. We did a similar flow chart for that. I think for me, these flow charts are important because I think we really get sometimes stuck on the left side of the slide, the regulation perspective on regulations and why we're doing certain things and what we're worried about or concerned about when we are implementing some of these things. So, we default to that regulation perspective. This was really a top-down approach based on the McKinney-Vento Act. Those requirements are passed down through HUD. We see them in our grant agreements or even our sub-grant agreements or sub-recipient agreements. And, we have to implement these largely based on what HUD says and also what guidance we're getting about compliance and monitoring and things like that. But I think because we work with people, we can't lose sight of the person-centered perspective. So when we're assisting someone in locating and obtaining housing, their concerns aren't about the regulations, right? Their concerns are about, we could talk about it very broadly about safety and location. So, they're further considering safety as part of the geographical location, looking at aspects like crime, but also considering other things that might trigger them, which, may be of note, like lighting or access to certain things or sounds and things like that. There's also the safety concern regarding environmental things like air quality or water quality. If a family has a child with asthma or something, they may be concerned about proximity or what the air quality is like in that area. Also, the location on the other side of this is more than just the physical space. So we can think of what amenities are available, and we'll talk about more of that later in this training, but also the health aspect of it. We want to make sure that people are choosing a space that is good for their physical and mental health. So, I think to draw this into the practical side, when we're assisting someone on finding housing, are we looking at the constraints of FMR and rent reasonableness as the primary driver of which unit is chosen, or are we giving the agency to the person or the household to determine what unit or place is right for them and making sure that it's within the regulations that we have? I know in my personal experience, I've met a lot of people who were searching for units, who were experiencing homelessness, and they knew all about FMR and they could tell me what the FMR rates were. And I'm not sure if that's really, and I was always really surprised about that because it feels like it's important for them to know what the kind of rent limits are, but that shouldn't, they seemed a little overeducated, and it was more about the regs and less about what kind of unit they wanted to live in. So this is just I'm going to do just real high level basic definitions, and we'll go into FMR a little bit deeper. Many of you probably know this already, that HUD has established FMR. This is a national standard in order to ensure a reasonable supply of adequate housing and it's accessible to participants. So HUD establishes both the gross rent, which includes both rent and utilities. These FMR fees are published annually, and they're usually published around October 1st. So just a quick little rent reasonableness look. Rent reasonableness ensures rents are paid and are reasonable in relation to the rents being charged for comparable unassisted units in the same market. Three of the most important factors in explaining the differences in rent are the location of the unit, the number of bedrooms in the unit, the type of unit, whether it's in a high rise, a garden apartment, or single family home, and what other amenities and utilities they are. Sometimes we look at housing conditions, whether it's good, fair, or poor, whether it's well maintained and things are up to date, whether it's fair and an expected condition for its age, for example, if things are in working order, or poor, that things aren't in working order, as inaccurate and inadequate sanitation structures, things like that. With regard to amenities within the unit, those could be on-site or in the neighborhood, such things as unit amenities could be the washer dryer, furnishings, appliances, whether it's a balcony, the location. Often we're looking at whether it's accessible to public transportation, or even if it's walkable or bikeable, depending on what the person is looking for. On-site amenities could be parking, laundry, pool, fitness center, things like that. Neighborhood amenities, parks, community centers, library, grocery store, and then the accessibility of the unit, whether someone can actually enter into it. So let's talk just a little bit about the recipient's role, or subrecipient, or sub-subrecipient's role. So, you're responsible for determining what documentation is required to ensure the rent is reasonable and that standard is met. You need to maintain that documentation, include supporting evidence, and then compare the rent. Comparable rents vary over time, and ensure that comparison is up to date and appropriate. It's really the best practice to update comparable units for an annual basis. It's important that reviews are conducted for all units prior to executing a lease. Failing to do so could mean you may have to terminate that lease and work to find a different unit. We want to try to minimize any kind of disruptions like that for the client with relocating them. So it's important to have rent reasonableness done before the lease is signed, and sometimes it can lead to financial liability for your program. The other thing to remember is, some projects just check rent reasonableness annually, regardless if someone has a new lease or moves or the rent goes up. But generally, if there's a new lease, we need to redo rent reasonableness, and also if there's a change, usually an increase in rent. So sometimes we do see decreases too. From what kind of policies and procedures do you need for rent reasonableness? I mean, I feel like one of the messages I'm always telling people is make sure you have the policies and procedures in place and that you're following them. So when someone comes to monitor you, that you have all those things ready to go, and that you can speak to those things. So you want to have a methodology for comparing rents, practices to troubleshoot challenges with finding comparable units. You want case file checklists and forms. You want standards for certifying that those comparable rents are in fact reasonable. You may need to have some staffing assignments with that, who's doing rent reasonableness, and then strategies for addressing when you have special circumstances. So with HUD's fair market rent, this assumes that your rent includes the necessary utilities. So there are additional steps projects will need to take whenever tenants pay for utilities separately for rent. This may result in a reduction of the tenant's portion of the rent payment, or utility reimbursement that can occur as well. We can only use this to cover the eligible utilities when we're talking about utilities. So things like cable and internet, which we know are, especially internet, is essential for people today. That's unfortunately still not covered as an eligible utility. So examples of documentation. So I think someone was looking at this in the chat too. So a market study of rents that are charged is one example of documentation you can have. If you're sometimes when we're having trouble finding comparable units, we could ask for written verification from a property owner or a management company. So this has to be an official letter on letterhead, and that they're affirming that the rent is in fact comparable to a similar unit that is unassisted and owned and managed or owned by the same owner. And then the last one is you can review advertisements for comparable units as well. There's lots of different sources for rental data. Some of the typical ones we see are using the Public Housing Authority. They release rent amounts. There's maybe real estate boards in your community that are publishing rents, real estate listings like Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist. Though I was preparing last night and wondering if like Chris and I are aging ourselves. Do people still use Craigslist? Is that a thing? Let us know in the chat. There's other online sources though too. So when I used to have a lot of partners that would use something called Rentometer or Rentometer, as I learned it was called last night because I watched one of their videos. So potato, Rentometer, Rentometer and they would use that for rent reasonableness. So what this does is you put in an address and even the bedroom size or number of bathrooms, and it will come back with a listing of comparable units for the last 6 or 12 months or whatever time frame you put in. This is usually a paid resource, and it's pretty amazing actually, because you can see a lot of units that you might not find just doing like a search on Facebook Marketplace or Google or Craigslist or things like that. I think that the challenge of that is you can't just print out that report and say, this is my comparison for rent reasonableness, right? So I want to caution folks that in your policies and your process, that certain online sites can be helpful in locating units that you could use in that comparison, but they generally may not have all of the information about what amenities or what's included in a rent to make it comparable to the unit that you're looking for. But it can be a really good starting point to find units that might be comparable. And the last one, everyone loves a good checklist. So we just wanted to give an example of, this is the HUD sample for rent reasonableness. It shows that comparing the unit that your person is looking at to rent versus 3 other units. You can use whatever form you want. You just need to ensure that the documentation or what you're comparing looks at location, quality, size, unit type, the age of the unit, as well as what amenities, housing services, maintenance, and utilities. And the owner should be able to provide that information to you if it's not publicly available. You'll notice that at the bottom is calculating the gross rent. You should consider the entire housing cost, including any utilities that the lease says that are the tenant's responsibility. So again, you don't have to use HUD's checklist, but you just want to make sure you're using these criteria and being consistent in your process and your policy. I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Great, thank you, Karen. And Karen, I think you addressed the documentation question earlier, but just want to kind of follow up, and kind of having this checklist or using another checklist is a very helpful cover sheet for that documentation. In that you are, able to hold all that information and then have, each of the units that you're looking at. And I know there were a couple of other questions from Angela, from Ava, and we will get to those a little bit further in the session. And if you want us to dig in deeper when we do get there, please re-elevate your question. And when we think about rent reasonableness and fair market rent, it feels like it can be pretty straightforward, right? You're looking for, okay, well, it's a 2-bedroom unit here, and it's a 2-bedroom unit there, and it has, generally similar size, parking, kind of, whatever other kind of components come with that unit. But this is also a real opportunity to think about the livability and kind of promoting better access to units that might be providing more, and being able to use rent reasonableness, especially kind of within the ESG-CV program where fair market rent is not carrying, and to really be able to zero in, for me, on the two kind of middle rows, location and accessibility, and the amenities, kind of unit, site, neighborhood discussion, to think about, what are other ways that a unit might be a little bit more expensive, but you can justify that by looking at the location, at the amenities. And so I want to expand our thinking a little bit as we discuss that. If we can go ahead to the next slide. The first is really looking at what amenities a unit or a building or a space is offering. Is there, if you're looking at a larger multifamily project, is there a community space? If you're looking at a smaller property or a single family property, what is the outdoor space? What is the appliance quality that a tenant would be getting? And if there is good access to outdoor space, if there is access to a community room or to a community space, to the security of the building or the security of the unit, taking that into consideration of how you calculate rent reasonableness. Moving to the next slide, also thinking about the health of the unit and really wanting to push and promote healthy units. So looking at the air quality, what is the air filtration? This is something that, we talk a lot about kind of now, and thinking about air quality and air filtration, especially in multifamily properties. Considering lead paint, has there been lead paint abatement? Has there been lead paint testing? What is your confidence level in the safety of that unit? And a high confidence threshold, can relate to justifying and supporting a higher rent. And that is okay, and that can be a good thing, right? That is to be putting somebody into a safer, healthier unit. Is there water filtration? Especially if you're looking at an area that may have a lead service pipes, have those pipes been replaced? Is there water filtration for other issues that might kind of be arising from the municipal water source? And again, all of that being kind of an opportunity within your rent reasonableness to be justifying a rent. I think it was great kind of as everyone was introducing themselves, and kind of as we hop to the next slide, you all were sharing community assets that you appreciate, right? From kind of access to outdoor space, views, I think views of mountains, access to parks and recreation. What are community assets right now as you look within your ESG-CV, ESG programs, that may impact the cost of a unit? And if we kind of jump to the next slide, there are plenty that we can be thinking about. Are there access to parks and playgrounds? Are there access to public transit, to quality schools, access to job centers, to grocery stores, to community centers? Krista, you raised kind of a great question in the chat of, can you be looking at socioeconomic or crime or other data and considering that within the asset. And the short answer is yes, you absolutely can. It is, you are establishing kind of what your policies and procedures that you're looking at for rent reasonableness. And if you want to identify and value different factors at a higher level and can use that as part of your justification, that can be, and I would recommend should be a component of how you think about rent reasonableness. Right, I think the map that we have up on the slide right here, is a map of areas identified by USDA that are kind of low-income census tracts, low-income geographies that are in urban areas 1 mile from a grocery store, and in rural areas 5 miles from a grocery store. And thinking about, well, what is the value of putting someone not in a food desert, and being able to use that as part of your justification. I think so often when we're looking at that checklist that Karen had pulled up earlier, we often think, well, we need to do the one that is the least expensive, right? We need to have that unit be the least expensive unit, and that isn't the case. That's not a requirement by any means. You can say, well, this unit was $1,500, but this unit that is 3 blocks from a park and 2 blocks from a public transit center, is $250 more a month. But that access to resources and support, justifies that unit. We think that is a justifiable difference in something that we would be supporting. I want to pause here. I think this is just can bring up a lot of questions of kind of justification. So kind of giving folks a chance to type in or go ahead and raise your hand. And we can work with you to unmute you. If folks have any questions. And Jen, great question. I think Karen touched on this. We're going to touch on it again in just a minute. Your rent, the FMR requirement for ESG-CV and ESG-19 and ESG-20 was waived. So that requirement for FMR for your 1920 formula ESG and your ESG-CV requirement is not a requirement. And then there is the possibility of a waiver for ESG-21. And that would be something you would need to work with your grant administrator on confirming if you have access to that waiver or not. Karen, anything you want to add here?
No, I'm good. I'm good for it. But Chris, I think, also like this is a different way of thinking about, rent reasonableness, and which applying these regulations and rules we have to follow, then how we, sometimes help folks find a place to live, right? And so I think it's a change, and so probably sure people just need a minute to think about it, because it's what we should be doing, right? Putting people in places and communities where they want to be and have the right assets for them.
Yeah. A couple questions about waivers. Sheila, we're going to hop to that in a couple of slides. Let's continue on. I think first, kind of talking about the differences between FMR and rent reasonableness. FMR, this is a value that is established by HUD. It comes out every year, generally in the fall. And you need to be using that FMR amount for the geographic area, city, county, metro area in which the housing unit is located. And you're using kind of your FMR, that's aligning with your grant start end date. Rent reasonableness has a lot more flexibility. It is your policy that you're establishing. You get to identify and define, as Karen was talking earlier, you are choosing, okay, well, this is how we are going to consider rent reasonableness. This is how we're going to determine what is reasonable. We are going to use the HUD checklist that Chris linked to. We are going to use our own checklist that we are going to adapt from that or create kind of on our own, and kind of consider how we're going to be determining what is and is not reasonable. It may be through a market study. It may be through, looking at other rents. It may be getting, validation from the property owner or real estate agents and renting agents within the community. You have that flexibility. Next slide. So questions about kind of, what are the requirements for ESG-CV versus ESG versus COC? Karen and I were kind of joking before the workshop that we, wish kind of all of these regs and kind of everything was always the same. It would make, program requirements a bit easier to follow, but there are nuances as we look at the different programs. And so those are, nuances that we need to operate within. Again, we're generally looking at for ESG and CV, kind of around your rapid rehousing and homeless prevention programs, essentially any rental assistance. COC, a little bit more, can also include PSH and transitional housing. Rent reasonableness, ESG-CV and ESG, you must comply with the standard of rent reasonableness. The framework of what is required, is in the regs, but again, you are establishing your own local policy on rent reasonableness. Within the COC program, again, needing to comply with the rent reasonableness requirements that you are establishing in that program. For fair market rent, for ESG-CV, and this includes FY19 and FY20 ESG, the fair market rent requirement is waived and does not apply. It is not something that you need to document or consider within your program. Otherwise, for formula ESG, with an exception that we'll talk to on the next slide, rental assistance cannot exceed fair market rent. Lauren, I appreciate and I feel kind of the struggle that you feel that working within the bounds of FMR is a struggle and can be a challenge. That is the requirement for the formula ESG program. Within the COC program, your rental assistance can exceed FMR, in some instances, and there's a bit of a difference kind of in that flexibility there. So talking to the waiver, there's a blanket waiver that is applied for ESG-CV, again, in 19 and 20. And that waiver is that you can provide rental assistance above FMR so long as you're documenting that rent is reasonable. And again, that is a blanket application to FY19 ESG, FY20 ESG, and ESG-CV. There is, for ESG-21, the possibility or the flexibility of that waiver being extended to confirm access to that waiver. You should follow up with your grant administrator to confirm if you have access to that waiver. that was not a blanket waiver that was applied nationally. It is something that needs to be applied for. We are going to kind of move into to talk through a couple of different scenarios. And I think this is going to hit on a couple of the questions that have been coming in. And we will, again, if we don't get to them, by all means, or if you're wanting more information or wanting to kind of drill down a little bit further, we can take time to do that today. So in the first scenario, kind of moving to the next slide, looking at an urban example here, we're looking in Oakland, looking at a property in West Oakland, the Red Star, where the rent for the unit is $19.50. And kind of in thinking about how we compare that, right? Maybe kind of that's a 2-bedroom unit, and we can find 2 comparable 3-bedroom units that are also for rent at the same time. As we go ahead to the next clip, Karen. And they happen to be a lot more expensive. And so I think then you're left saying, well, can we compare a 2-bedroom to a 3-bedroom and make that justification of being units that are happening to be available at the same time? What you may choose to do is instead start to look at, well, were there units that were recently leased? Can we find a rental listing from a month ago? And maybe we can find some things that are a bit closer and things that kind of fit and help justify a bit more. And if we kind of go ahead and jump to the next, can look to find, units that are closer, also 2-bedroom units, that are more closely matching in price and kind of helping to show kind of where that unit can be reasonable. So I think kind of the takeaway here is kind of even in an urban setting, you may be looking and saying, well, gosh, there's really only one, unit of the same unit size, or, that is available at this point in time. And you're looking kind of in, geographies outside of that neighborhood that might not be good comparisons. You can look at saying, okay, well, what was on the rental market a month ago? What was on the rental market, 6 weeks ago, to be using as a potential comparison, and using that as part of your justification. I think where kind of a lot of the questions so far have been coming, we can jump to this next, is talking more about a rural example where there really isn't anything for rent, or maybe kind of if you're looking at this unit that's the one Red Star, you can find one other comparable unit, and if we can go ahead and click forward, but it happens to be in the adjacent county, and might be a very different kind of price structure, very different price point, and hard to compare. Or clicking forward again, seeing that there are other units available, but they're in very different parts of the county, and really, really hard to make a comparison between one community, one geography within the county with a geography that is 20, 30, 40 miles away, in a very different kind of economic landscape. So kind of thinking about that, there's a couple of different things that you can do. And again, I think it becomes really important that you're documenting how you do this thinking in your policies and procedures, right? You are able to establish what and how you are doing and why you are doing it. And so here, kind of clicking ahead, you may choose to to consult with a real estate agent to help determine market value of understanding, okay, we're finding a unit for $1,500, and having a real estate agent kind of certify and agree, that seems like market rate. That is a reasonable rent, based on unit size, unit conditions, and so on. You can also compare to other areas of the county and kind of make note and account for the differences in assets between one geography, one city and another city, one town and another town, as well as market demand, right? Kind of looking here kind of on the map, there may be, more assets in one city than another city. There may be better access to outdoor space. There may be better schools. There may be better access to jobs. There may just be higher demand kind of in that area. And kind of accounting for those differences and documenting those differences as a way of justifying kind of when you're looking at a bigger rural area and having kind of a harder time kind of making those direct comparisons. I think we can pause here. I know kind of for a lot of people thinking about rural examples can bring up a lot of questions. So I just want to kind of take a breath here. Karen, you may have other items you want to add, but if folks do have questions, please type them in. And as folks are, Ava, I'm kind of reading your comment now, and I think you're asking, should you be writing a dialogue providing how the housing is supportable due to amenities in the area? I think writing that dialogue, and I think writing it in a way that you can be justifying different price points, right? Being able to justify, well, area one has these amenities, area two does not, and therefore, it could be considered reasonable that rent in area one would be higher than area two. Krista, are you asking if I just want to make sure I'm understanding your question, and if easier to hop off mute, please do. If kind of thinking about one's own support network of friends and family and community, could be a way to be justifying price. Is that?
For instance, I had like an individual, and she had a lot of family members that would help with her child and childcare and things like this. She had gone to the same church since she was a little girl, so she preferred a specific town, but there was more a better fit financially in a different town within the county. But the family preference and these things were trying to be weighed in. Does that help? You understand?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if I have an answer for you here. It may be something that we want to follow up with. I don't know, Karen, if you have a thought on that.
Fair enough. Thank you so much.
I was thinking the same thing, Chris. This might be something we want to follow up on that one.
I will say we will follow up, but I think, Krista, I really like that logic, right, of thinking about, how to set, finding a unit that is best suited to help an individual or help a family, be
right, like
their
if they have
most
a
successful
transportation
self.
issue, then maybe they can have that network to rely on, the church, things like this, and it would not limit their resources as much as I felt like it would be more taking them away from their group would be more traumatizing to the resource network that they had already, if they had it established.
Yeah. Krista, if I don't think we have mine or Karen's emails on this deck, but if you want to send one of us a private message, we'll make sure to follow up with you and kind of work with you and your grant administrator on kind of thinking through that question. It's a great question.
I mean, Chris, I do wonder about like when we think about like living in one town versus another, especially in places with limited public transportation and folks having to rely on like a Lyft or an Uber or something to get from town to town. I mean, like just the cost difference of that, right? Like staying in one town, like it feels like for rent reasonableness, there's a justification of like, even though it's more expensive in this town, if we move them to the other town, it actually costs them more because they would be traveling back and forth, or their family would be traveling back and forth. So it seems like, but we'll have a response. But I think like sometimes
for college, things like this, jobs, living close to a job, living out of town where it's $500 a month versus spending $1,000 a month in gas at the same rate. So, those are, thank you.
Andrea, I appreciate your LOL. I grew up in a town of 700 people, and getting any form of public transit, even a school bus some days, seemed hard. I think, Krista, there's one piece, right, that kind of access to jobs, kind of in identifying units that have an asset that is, a fairly generic asset that could be applied across different people. I think that is a very reasonable and appropriate response, right? So if it's saying, well, unit A is near these job centers, unit B is not, I think that can be a justifiable difference. I think where we want to follow up is, can you customize that per individual? And then I think it becomes a decision
how
for
could you
all.
Validate that as evidence, I guess, is where the hiccup piece is.
Right, and if in kind of the level of effort kind of that could entail, for you all. I think, Andrea, you again, kind of bringing up, community assets. If you're looking at kind of language or cultural access, I think those can be, viable amenities that you are considering and taking into consideration. I think the important thing, and I think Karen and I, are a bit of a broken record on this, but, is making sure as you think about that, you're documenting and justifying kind of that within your program policies and procedures. We're jump ahead to the next slide, and talk a little bit about troubleshooting. And troubleshooting so often comes to not being able to find 3 other units for comparison. We can go to the next slide. The first, I think, looking in, in rural communities, and then looking at kind of unique housing, SRO units, shared housing, ADUs. There was a comment earlier about considering trailers and how to use a trailer in comparison. And I think within all of these, there are best practices that you can apply, and we can spend more time talking and responding to your questions on them. But in looking at the next slide, if you're not able to.
Before we leave that slide, I just wanted to bring up something that is kind of unique to California that I wanted to just put in place on the unit, on the type of units we've seen, as Project Home Key has moved out and started to be operationalized in communities, that they're creating units that we don't have comparable units for, right? We have this large hotel, we're creating single room occupancies, we don't have a lot of those. How to make those comparisons, I think folks are struggling with, and I think it goes into that unique housing is, if you have never had anything like Project Home Key in your community before, how do you compare it to other things like it? Because it's just not, it's not a 2-bedroom. It's just, it's likely a studio or something more like that. So it is something I think we're seeing specific to California.
Yeah, no, it's a great addition. I think and some of the best practices that we can talk to, I think, touch on that maybe in looking at our next slide. I think one, if there are similar units, or if you are in a rural community, you may not have 3 units that are open or available kind of at any given time. But looking for recently leased units, it is again, right, kind of if you're using Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist or kind of whatever kind of source that you're identifying units, that may be harder, to be identifying what was recently leased. You can find some of that in working with a real estate agent or consulting with a real estate agent. They may have, some access, or a property management company of having access to units that were recently available. When you're thinking about, unique situations, SRO, kind of the project home key, trailers, other, ADUs or shared housing, being able to document the rationale for that price differential between different units. And again, I think this may be where, at the very top of the presentation, Karen talked about, that you may be using, current listings. You can also be using a market study. You can also be, consulting with an expert or consulting with and getting documentation from the property management company, to be justifying kind of those price differentials. That may be an opportunity where you want to be looking and saying, okay, well, if a 2-bedroom unit, which is relatively standard, making that rationale yourself, or using a market study, or using consultations with real estate agents, consultation with property management companies, of helping to understand what their thought would be on kind of current unit prices, and doing that on a somewhat regular basis, to make sure you have a current set of kind of justifications. And then documenting rationale for price differential in different neighborhoods. You may have SROs in one part of the community, in one part of the county, but not in others. And being able to kind of justify, well, what are some of the price differentials between that one part of the county and the other part of the county, and being able to use that, within your justification. And then finally, being able to, consult with local experts. I think I've kind of harped on this a couple of times in the past few minutes, but being able to use those consultations to help kind of in your justification, right? And having someone providing their analysis, their assessment, kind of with on their letterhead that you're using as part of your justification to show, look, we didn't have 3 units. That's option 1 within our policies. Option 2, we look for recently leased. If there aren't, or if it's unique housing, we may choose to be consulting with 1 or 2 or 3 property managers or rental agents operating within the community, who can help with that justification. And I think as we go ahead to the next slide, again, making sure, this is in your policies and procedures, kind of your order of operation, kind of that you're doing, you want to document your thinking so that, if HUD comes to monitor your program, they're seeing, okay, prior to you providing this rapid rehousing assistance, you had thought through kind of how you would be determining reasonableness of a unit and being able to justify, okay, we found, we followed this other approach to make sure it works. And there's one question that was just kind of directly messaged to me. Do you need to have 3? Is that a requirement of HUD? And kind of 3 comparable units, I think that's something that has been kind of generally settled upon. But that again is not a requirement within the statute. The statute doesn't say you need 3 comparable units. So if you're only able to find 2, again, if your policies and procedures are written in a way to give you that flexibility, you can take a different approach to how you think about rent reasonableness.
Chris, did you want to address the RV question before we move on to the next? I guess that could just be under a challenge or issue too.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think in the RV question, right, I think we're, first bound by making sure, you're operating within the habitability requirements within, ESG and ESG-CV, and making sure that you're not kind of losing track of that. But assuming it is, something that you would deem to be eligible for assistance, I think you would take, that similar approach. That again is probably something where you're not finding a lot of direct comparables, and you would want to be, looking at consultation with a local expert, kind of expanding your search, or kind of looking at what does that unit have compared to other units that may have more space, different offerings, and then kind of being able to justify that price differential to determine reasonableness.
Great. I think
I'm wondering, Karen, if you kind of wouldn't mind just going back to slide number 12. I think now that we've kind of talked through policies and procedures, if we can, I know it's hard to click back, kind of documenting the different ways of, or different examples of documentation. And I think one more. Of just highlighting this, and I think kind of holding this here of, these being different ways that you can document reasonableness. Other questions, thoughts, challenges that you all are facing? Miriam, you asked about having new SROs kind of coming online and having a kind of hard time finding comparisons as well as fitting them into the FMR framework. I'm wondering, Karen, if you want to kind of start there in the FMR framework, is that I think is the more binding, and then we can talk about the rent reasonableness side. you may be on mute, Karen, if you're.
I am. I was just having trouble with finding the unmute button. I mean, I think that, the challenge with the SRO is, I mean, there is a formula for determining what the rent amount is for FMRs. I think it's like 70% of a 0-bedroom or something like that. So you can calculate what the fair market rent rate would be for that. I think that's the first is, locating and applying that formula to your specific area and your just standard FMR amounts, is kind of that formula of it. Guess I don't know what else to say about that with the FMR framework because it's so rigid.
Right, and being bound to that kind of, unfortunately, kind of regardless of the unit components, right?
Yeah.
I think from a rent reasonableness perspective, I think it, if it is something brand new, you may find it easier to be consulting, with the property manager, consulting with a real estate agent in the community who can help with the justification. That could be a helpful approach. I think then too, I'm not sure where you are in the state, Miriam, but could be looking at, are there other SROs in adjacent counties, adjacent geographies that you could be kind of looking at and starting to use that as the basis. It can be almost helpful to benchmark and say, okay, well, we don't have, SROs, but there are SROs kind of in one county over. And then you can compare, okay, well, what's the difference between a 1-bedroom? What's the difference between a comparable 2-bedroom? And start to make a bit of an analysis of understanding, okay, that seems kind of on par with that relative difference. Karen, a question I think you can talk to from the regs from Andrea, if you can just use FMR if you're below FMR, or do you always have to do FMR and rent reasonableness?
Sorry, it's not in my right head with questions. I mean, I've always done reasonableness, even if it falls within the limits of FMR, just to ensure that that rent is comparable, right? And that there are other options for you. So I think, Chris, you can contradict me, but unfortunately, I think you still have to do the exercise of reasonableness, even if it isn't within the FMR limits, unfortunately.
Right. It's not a lesser of the two. Kind of, you're always documenting rent reasonableness. I have always felt, to me, like the threshold of proof isn't as great when you're below FMR. Because HUD is establishing that as a reasonable rent, but you are still needing to document that rent reasonableness.
I mean, and Andrew, you can't gain efficiency. Like if your project isn't just looking for one bedroom unit, right? Like if you're actually housing, so you can sometimes use the same unit to compare with them. So that's some ways I've found efficiency is that, especially if you're in a small geographic area or a small town, like you may be looking at, you can kind of, you don't have to find brand new units for every single 1-bedroom you're comparing, right? So that's helpful. And also some of the things that I think, Chris, we mentioned about market analysis and getting support from real estate agents. Sometimes you can use those again. Don't feel like you're picking something as a one and done, as long as that's not, the new unit isn't drastically different than the previous one in some way.
Yeah, I live in in Boston, and we have a lot of triple decker units, and maybe looking at one unit for assisted payment, and needing to document rent reasonableness, but the other 2 units are being rented in the private market, and will often kind of seek for that owner or property manager to kind of show, okay, well, the rent for units 2 and 3 is X and Y, and being able to use that to show, okay, well, here are 2 comparable units that were rented on the private market, and they're going for the same amount, or slightly greater, and can be justifying that from a rent reasonableness perspective. And I think, I think, Krista, that answers your question on an apartment complex. And I think we often overlook that, right? I think the checklist that Karen showed, that Chris sent the link out to, I think my head always jumps there, right? For rent reasonableness is thinking, okay, we have to fill out that form, but getting something on letterhead from that property owner, from the
manager of the apartment complex, that these other units were available with the same demographics at the same rate.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Ooh,
Exactly.
you just made my day, bro. Thank you.
Great. All right. Hopefully we can make some other people's days. Anyone else? We've got 52 more minutes to make people's days. But no, Krista, joking aside, that is, really want to emphasize that for everybody, because I think so often we're looking at, even if you're in a rural community, right, you're looking at a 2-family or a 3-family or, a 6-family or an 8-family unit where you may be taking 2 or 3 of those units. And getting that documentation is a lot easier than, trying to hunt for, comparisons at the northern end of the county.
Yeah, I think too, lots of you are in tight rental markets too, right? So maybe there is only 1 unit available in that complex. And so you could have the owner talk about rents, like units that were rented in the last month or 2 months or 6 months, and attest that those previous units were comparable, and also, fell under the reasonableness aspect of it. So you could ask them to go back and if you're trying for 3 and there's only, you can only find 2, but that landlord had, or that complex had other units available a month or 2 or 3 ago, you could go back to that owner and see if they would write a similar letter.
Up to 3 months?
I think the time frame is always challenging, right, Krista? I think I think in that letter, I would have him attest to that, when how long that rent amount, he's been charging that rent amount, just to show that it's been reasonable. If it is further back than a time you think that, is that too far, right? So some landlords don't change the rent on the unit for a year, right? And so they could attest to it as long as they haven't had lots of fluctuation in their rent they're charging, right? Or justify why the rent was less 6 months ago, and it's higher now, because they understand their market better about those.
So can I give you a quick scenario? If I housed in 1 unit, I could use their information to justify the next person coming in if it was a month or 2 later. Or does it not need to be one of my clients, just a different in the complex?
I think ideally you are comparing to an unassisted unit. So you don't want to be comparing an assisted unit to an assisted unit. I think the rent reasonable test is to show what the federal government is paying for rent is on par with what the private market is accepting for rent for that type of unit. So you're losing.
If the rent rate wasn't decreased for the program.
That's right, Krista. If he's not making it more affordable or less,
correct, like half the security deposit or something like that would disqualify. But if it was getting purchased at the fair market value, what they were requesting.
Yeah, if you're renting it for the rate that he's advertising it for, then that would hold the mark for it. If you've negotiated him to rent it to you for less, and the other comparable units in that complex are going for more, then that's what Chris is getting to. You want to make sure the comparison
Right.
is to other unassisted, right? So,
And my eyes were sparkling at the 3-month number because we're a 3-month decreasing assistance. So if I can use up to 3 months and we fall off at 3 months, it takes that piece away anyways as well. So thanks for.
Sarah, you asked a question about rent rates increasing, kind of in guidelines of kind of when would you have to redo a rent reasonableness. There is kind of a standard for that that has been provided for HUD. I don't remember it off the top of my head. So Chris, is that something that Karen and I could provide to you and could be sent out to the group? I just want to make sure that we get the right number for everybody on that in terms of threshold.
and Chris, someone asked earlier in the chat about month to month, like what about increases, if there's increases in a month to month renting situation? When would rent reasonableness need to be redone for that?
I think that would be under the same threshold of what that rent would be going up by. And I just want to make sure that I kind of cite that correctly. Other questions, comments, thoughts, kind of troubleshooting that folks have?
Scenarios.
Krista, I think if using Section 8 on a unit and then being able to use that as part of your justification, can you?
Yes, if I could clarify. So client typically probably would not be able to afford, but because she is on Social Security fixed income. And so like that 30% number that you're trying to hit at reeval is not going to be possible, but the blessing is Section 8 is going to be in place before that time period comes. So would that adjust the rent rate, which would alleviate the need to satisfy that 30% threshold? Is that making sense?
I'm not sure if I'm following. I'm sorry.
But what does that have to do with the rent reasonableness standard, Krista? And because like that's the client portion of the rent, right? And so you've already rented the unit. How much their ability to pay, like if they have income up to 30% of their income was the kind of that part of it. But I guess I'm just
at contract, the rent rate will be 50% income, which is justifiable as far as I could read and understand, as long as at reevaluation, income is set at 30% rent rate. So is the Section 8 reduction in the rent price going to help her be able to meet that 30% income threshold? Is that better?
Asking about is the appropriateness. Oh, I'm sorry. I think what Chris is asking about is the appropriateness of a unit for a particular client. Would it be okay to get a client into a unit that technically for them right now would not be considered affordable, but by the time it's their responsibility to pay the rent, it will be affordable because the program is going to help them get Section 8 in place by then. Is that what you're asking, Krista?
Correct. You got it, Andrea.
So because right now you're not using Section 8 to assist with the rental amount, right? You're using, let's just say rapid rehousing, right? I think
basically correct. And that's to get the security deposit because Section 8 will also not cover security and we can't double dip the chips. So we're trying to time this properly, but also be within legal limits and such. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think because you're starting with something like RH, you want to make sure that that passes the reasonableness standard and FMR if you need to do that. when they transition to Section 8, you may have to do some other form of reasonableness for them too. But that doesn't mean that unit's not going to still be reasonable under the standards of the housing authority or Section 8. So in that
Because I personally am struggling with putting that. I want it to be ethical, but I also want them to get housing. The program is closing, like all these squishy pieces. And so that's why I'm kind of relying on some experts, because I'm definitely not that.
I mean, it sounds like what you're doing is what we want people to do with something like rapid housing, is bridging people who have financial constraints because of their disability or their income, that they won't revert back to homelessness, and you're getting them into that public housing voucher. So that's exactly what, like, the kind of transition, like, you may have to be a little bit careful of like when one ends and one begins with like the paying of the rent and things like that. But from a services standpoint, you don't, like, you could still help with case management because there's usually not that, but like just from the rent portion, you don't want to double dip, you don't want to have the duplication of benefits. But I think from the lens of like, is this a comparable, reasonable unit? Like, you've already done that work, and that should transition over to the PHA's things as well. So
Perfect. That's my real question, is because all this rent reasonableness, it was not occurring during the whole what I've done, and so it's very new, and I'm like, right at the end. So thank you for helping me understand. I appreciate that.
Coming back to Sarah's question and the month-to-month question, I just double checked on the regs, and anytime the owner increases the rent, you need to redo rent reasonableness. Where I was thinking percentage threshold is if FMR is reduced in your community by 10%, you would also need to redo your rent reasonableness. And so those would be the two times that you would be needing to recalculate rent reasonableness, which I think, to the month-to-month question makes that a fairly prohibitive agreement. And I think also emphasizes the value within ESG and ESG-CV of using your leverage to create a one-year lease agreement, and setting more parameters that you can to be protecting your tenant.
We had a number of questions in the chat, but I think you have answered them all as you went. So if someone did enter a question, they don't feel like it was fully answered, go ahead and ask that, because I kept a list of them, but I think I've seen an answer to all of them. So I'm not necessarily going to raise them up. I
think so too. Or if people, like, you heard the answer, and if you want more clarification, because it's with all the different funding sources and waivers and years of ESG, it can be confusing. So there's only good questions here.
I was starting to answer Krista's question on mute, so I'll do it off mute. That's much more effective. Yes, so the PowerPoint and the recording will be sent out to all of you following the session. And we'll be posting it on our website soon. And if you need a 508 compliant version, that takes us a couple months to get that onto HCD's website. So we try to be as quick as possible to get you materials, but if you need accessible materials, that does take a bunch of time for us to process it and then HCD to process it. So there you go.
It looks like a couple questions coming in. Krista, I'm going to share a link to a great HUD product, that I kind of go back and check quite a bit when I'm thinking about rent reasonableness, of kind of the overview on the ESG and COC program. Rent reasonableness is also a public housing requirement, and I have found this guide on rent reasonableness from our kind of PIH colleagues to also be a very helpful tool. I don't think they give you a generic set of policies and procedures. I don't believe, Chris, Pitcher, that is something that HCD has created. I think that has been left to grantees to develop. Miriam asking for one more time, kind of talking about documentation. Karen, maybe we can kind of pull back up that slide. I think again, slide 12. A market study, either conducted in-house using a third party. If you're thinking about a third party, I would kind of strongly recommend you to reach out to a local college or university and see if you can get a math or a stats or a sociology program to help provide that for you. That is a very good way to get a market study done kind of in an affordable fashion. Or a review of advertisements for comparable units. That is where you would be using the checklist that Karen shared, and Karen maybe click forward to that checklist. Or adapting the checklist like this, and then ideally saving kind of the documentation of kind of where you found the information for units 1, 2, and 3 that you were comparing. But again, this would be how you define it in your policies and procedures.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my experience with HUD, if you're worried about HUD or HCD or someone coming to audit you or monitor you, I mean, I do think they do like this kind of summary chart or checklist at the front, and then they do I don't know, I'm not going to account for how intensely they go back and make sure all the things on this summary jive with what you printed out for like advertisements and things like that. But I think they do, like, if you're looking for a structure that's consistent and that people like to see, they do like seeing this kind of summary table or checklist filled out, and then knowing that, like Chris said, the documentation is behind. And I think most of us are just used to using ads we find on the internet or wherever to compare units. But I think some of the suggestions, like market studies and letters from property managers or building owners, like that's kind of different than what we're used to. And so I think that, but I think if you're kind of putting this checklist front and center, then having that documentation behind, you're going to be in a good space with them. I think with the letter, like back to Krista's question about like, can you just have units in the same building? I mean, I think you would want to make sure that you're with the property owners or managers, that you're giving them the right details of what you want in that letter, right? You want to make sure that they talk about the address and what the unit numbers are, and what they're like, if they have some sort of summary they can attach to it or description of those units. So those are some of the things you might want to consider when you're prepping or coaching them for what you want, and things like that. So so Krista's questions, like kind of adding on to what we just said, like what role does the caseworker have in carrying out this process? I mean, that depends a little bit on your own agency and how you write your policy and your process, right? I think, my experience in most agencies I worked with, they generally just had the caseworker that was whoever was helping that household or person find housing was the person who was in charge of the rent reasonableness. So You know, one of my last positions, we had a group that was, you know, they were landlord liaisons, and they were the ones who were finding the units, and they were helping to show those units to clients, and that wasn't the case manager. So that person's job was to do the rent reasonableness, right? In other situations I've been in or have seen agencies do, the case manager does unfortunately do it all, because they're also the one who has to do the housing location services too. So I think delineating that in your policy and your process is important, especially if you may have different people who are doing that, those different aspects, housing location versus just the long-term or, you know, the ongoing case management.
I did add into the chat a few resources that have been specifically created by California HCD. So you'll see the fair market rent and rent reasonableness policy is the first resource I just put in. And the second is the certification. It looks just very similar to what Karen has on the screen right now. There's a few little tweaks to it. HCD is not requiring you to use those forms, but certainly would prefer it or use this as well, which is what we based ours off of, basically. Just so you have those in your hand, I wanted to make sure you saw those in the chat.
I think that's a good point too, Chris. Like those of us who are operating as a recipient or subrecipient of someone else, like your first question should be to them as to what form they want you to use. And if they don't have one, you may need to create one of your own, right? So when we're talking about ESG and ESG-CV, lots of us are in subrecipients or sub-subrecipients or sub-subrecipients. And so making sure everything's in alignment is important, and that because some funders do have this kind of documentation or like requirements already done.
And we did get one question from KJ that I don't think we responded to. What is the radius for looking at rent reasonableness? It can really vary, you know, based on the type of community you're in, right? If you're in an urban or a suburban area, it might be much smaller. If you're in a rural area, it could be much bigger. It also depends on the unit type and how you're choosing to compare. You know, it may be the better part of the county. It could be the whole county that you're looking at, and you're doing some justification within that. Or it could be a much smaller area. And I think that would be within your policy what you're able to establish.
All right, if we have anything further, we'll go ahead and wrap up and give you a half hour back. But any parting remarks, Karen or Chris, based on the conversation we've had today?
No, that's, yeah, again, I think to Chris and I's like theme before we got on, this seems really straightforward, but when we start applying it, we know that just like with working with people, there's a lot of nuance, and there's a lot of like, sometimes a little stress and anxiety of like, how do I do this when I'm in a place I can't find enough units, or like all these things that we're all dealing with. So I think just be patient and give yourself a lot of grace, and reach out. You know, lots of the grant administrators are really knowledgeable, and they can also, if you have a burning question that they can't answer, I know Chris Pitcher can connect you to us too. So just, you know, it seems straightforward, but there's just nuance to it that sometimes makes it challenging.
Karen?
Yeah, thank you all. And if you do have questions as we get to implementation on this, or kind of thinking about how to apply it to your activities, both kind of future and current, and maybe even past, you know, please reach out if you need help.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Karen, for the presentation today. And thank you all for attending this California Housing Community Development Training Session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services contract. Look out for more information on our next community workshop series sessions. When this session ends, there's going to be a 3-question survey that pops up. Please give us feedback there. We do look at that every week and we make adjustments. One of the things that I want you to kind of consider for that 3-question survey today is what else might you need in the fair market rent reasonableness area. We've just done an 1.5-hour session on it. We can't answer absolutely every single question. As you heard, we did a good job answering most of them, but there are some that are very nuanced. But what would be useful for you to take this and make sure is in practice so that when you're monitored, your fair market rent or your rent reasonableness documentation and procedures are good, and it's not something we have to worry about either from the HCD level or the HUD level. So think about that in your survey responses today, because we have the ability to do more trainings like this, or to do workshops or other type of things to help you move fair market rent reasonableness policies into practice. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.